And I think the next one gives you an idea of the so these are the two heads of the Commission of Sciences and Arts, as it was called, Claude-Louis Berthollet and Gaspard Monge. Monge was a foundryman, so his study in smelting, metallurgy is unsurpassed. Berthollet was a chemist, dyes, fabrics, everything. In fact, Bonaparte one afternoon called him in and said, "You must find some time to be teaching me chemistry as well." He said, "But surely, General, you are very busy." "Yes, but I can at least an hour a day." So Bonaparte fancied himself very much a scientist and a scholar, first and foremost. And these two men were like father figures to him. So he confided in them. In fact, he had to get Monge specially on the trip because Monge, these two had helped him set up a similar commission in Italy in 1796. But Monge, he said, I'm not coming on this particular expedition. And Bonaparte was most put out. And he said, "Why?" And he wouldn't explain. Berthollet had an idea. So Bonaparte one day took a carriage and fetched up at the front doorstep of the Monge household and realized the real reason Monge was not going to come was because of Madame Monge. She didn't want him to go. So when apparently she met him on the doorstep, she took Bonaparte to be one of his underfed students. To explain, Bonaparte was very spare. He was about 5'4", I believe. But his nickname amongst the ladies of Paris was Puss in Boots because his hat looked so big and his boots looked so big. So it was a general joke, but he didn't care about this nonsense. He convinced Madame Monge to let Monge come on the trip, and so the pair of these, they set up the Institute of Egypt, l'Institut d'Égypte, with all the same powers of academe that the Institute in Paris had. And that's very important. So they set their own exams. They had younger members studying through their own curriculum that they created.
You know, this is completely new to me. Why would a military general be so fascinated with science? I find it very interesting,
Well,
very
the thing is,
commendable.
well, Bonaparte was not an infantry commander, really. He was an artilleryman. And if you worked in the artillery in the army at that time, you were halfway to being a scientist or a mathematician in order to understand trajectory, explosives, munitions, the muzzle velocities, all these sorts of things that infantry soldiers and officers never knew about.
Yeah.
So he was always fascinated by mathematics and science in general. So he knew he had all these hand-picked specialists around him. Why not get some extra tuition? He slept reputedly 3 hours a night at the most. He was perpetually drawn, exhausted, but he would not let himself sleep because he was in charge. But also what happened to him by taking Egypt and being away from France was the same thing that overtook Julius Caesar. He became the Sultan on the Nile. In fact, there is a story of him coming down to dinner with his fellow senior officers, dressed in a turban, robes, and slippers.
I didn't know that.
Apparently they burst out laughing, thinking it was a joke. It was not a joke. He wanted everyone to become Eastern. He wanted the glory of the Orient. So he sat down very quietly and they just started dinner and everyone was very embarrassed. So it's a clue as to what he was doing. At one point he said, "Europe, it is a molehill, full of moldy old duchies and so forth. But true glory lay in the Orient."
I mean,
He
this
wanted
is
to
really
be the
gives me another
same. Yes,
perspective. When I was
absolutely.
in French museums, I always asked myself, all these generals, everyone has an oriental looking sword or originally made Mamluk. where does this fascination come from? Thanks
Yes,
for explaining. I always ask myself, why? I mean, you see it among French swords, always this fascination with Oriental weapons. Now I
yes.
understand.
Well, at the time, of course, uh, they'd not been defeated by the Mamluk Shamshir or Saif at all, but they now recognized its power. So when they captured these Mamluk arms, they were so beautiful. And in fact, apparently, the swordsmiths, certainly when the English came a few years later, would not explain how they made the Damascus or Damascene blade. They kept it secret. So,
What we can do, what I would love to do in one of our future meetings, if you had time,
yeah,
I have pictured and have taken pictures and videos of the captured Mamluk arms in these battles. And I
yes,
would like to, and then also horse armor, Mamluk horse armor. I would
yes,
like to go through them with you because with your research in this area, you have a different perspective. It's very
yes.
interesting to see them if you wish.
Yes, so they either used captured swords. So, for example, in the fifth Hazard novel, I am dramatizing the funeral of General Kleber, and the memoirs just say, oh, his sword was laid upon his coffin. Well, I wanted to describe the sword, so I had to research what it was. And his favored sword was a Mameluke sword that he'd taken in the first arrival in Egypt, and he'd used it throughout his campaigning.
Fascinating.
So
Really
I think we have some
fascinating.
more savants coming up here. Ah, yes. So on the left, we have the youngest member. He was 17 years old when he signed on for this secret mission. And this is René Edouard de Villiers du Terrage. And he left a whole set of memoirs. On the right is Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. He was one of the most famous zoologists who worked under Cuvier. And these are competitors to Darwin for theory. Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, I think, is credited with the concept of extinctions. Nobody had really considered these things in biology before, but he did. And it was his job to collate the flora and fauna of the Nile and Egypt, everything, from the birds to the fish, salamanders, uh, plant life, the lot, everything. And he did all of that. And on the left, I refer to him in Discover at Rosetta as the Merlin of the expedition. This is Nicolas Jacques Conté. Now, if ever you have used colored pencils in your life, I'm going to suggest that they had possibly the name Conté on the end of
Yes.
them. And that is because at the time, there was a trade embargo between Britain and France. Britain produced vast amounts of graphite
Yes.
from the Lake District in the north of England and slate. This made pencils.
Yes.
France couldn't had a limited supply of this now, and whilst in Egypt they lost many of their supplies in the Battle of the Nile when they had not yet unloaded their ships. So Condé had to invent a type of colored pencil for the savants to use in their drawings. And he did this by means of colored clay. Quite extraordinary. He'd lost machines, he'd lost tools. So he built new tools to make new machines that could then make new tools. He built a fire engine for a boat to go up and down the Nile in order to pump Nile water out to extinguish fires in towns. He was extraordinary. Now, the other thing that he did was, of course, the balloons. One of the first things that they happened that as a celebration of the French New Year, which is in September, and of course the opening of the great Khalij al-Masri in Cairo, their great canal. It's a celebratory event. They would open the sluices and the Nile would flow and fill the canal and fill up all the ponds and irrigation systems in Cairo. But also the Nile was in flood. They tried to do a balloon ascendancy, a balloon trip to show all the people what France could do. And unfortunately, it just didn't work. But on the right, you see a part of Conte's work. That balloon in the painting
Yeah.
is the very first use of aircraft in battle in history. It is an artillery spotting balloon at the Battle of Fleurus in 1797. This is relevant in a way to the fact that Conte has a bandage on his covering his eye. It was damaged in an explosion in the chemistry lab. If he were depicted with his laboratory assistant on the other side of him, he'd have a bandage covering the other eye because he was on the other side of the explosion. That lab assistant was Pierre-François Xavier Bouchard, and he is the man who discovered the Rosetta Stone in the ground. So Conte, the savants, all of them, they're all interwoven in this extraordinary story. I think we see some more now.
Yes, Jonathan, just regarding the balloon, what did they throw from that balloon?
No, they weren't. They didn't actually use it to drop ordnance. It was to spot for the artillery. And then they would use semaphore or indeed mirror signal to say, correct your line of fire. If you hark back to trench warfare in 1914 and 1915, the first use of aircraft was not as aggressive bombers or even fighters. It was just reconnaissance artillery spotting because they were fixated on their artillery. It's the only way to shift the enemy.
And
So
before we started to record, you explained also the word regarding astronaut. And could you just tell us something
yes,
about
that's
that?
right. So to Conte and the savants, this was the Escadron Aéronautique. So this was the aeronautical squadron. So if you were a balloonist, that's our English word. In France, you were an aeronaut. And it's a wonderful expression because it's so vivid, isn't it? It's like
It
astronaut.
is. It's like
Astronaut
astronaut.
and the Argonauts, Jason and the Argonauts, because
Yeah.
they went places. For Conte, the aeronauts, they went into the air. So that's what they are navigating, nautique. They are navigating the skies. There's a wonderful, vivid expression. So here are the savants gathering in the Institute gardens. Now, from a European perspective, we'll think, oh, the gardens, and we think of the Tuileries gardens, maybe even the Bois de Boulogne, these sorts of, no, not at all. If you see a map of Cairo
Yeah.
and you look at the position of the institute on it and where the gardens of Qasim Bey, one of the exiled Mamelukes, was, you realize this was an entire hectare upon hectare of experimental farm that the savants used to study the plants and animal husbandry. It's where they had their workshops, and it was bordered by the canal and irrigated by the waters of the Nile. It was very extensive. So the riot, which eventually set fire to the Institute of Egypt in 2011, of course, could never really have happened because there was not a street entrance to the gate so close at the time. The place was more or less surrounded except on the one side. So they were huge, these gardens, filled with every type of tree. So you have sycamores, acacias, walnuts, oaks. Then you have, of course, palms and sisal, all of the things we associate with hot climate. I believe there was even cycads and strelitzia from down in South Africa, because all of these things would have been traded up and down the African coast. And these gardens would certainly have had examples of them. Okay, so here we have, these are two fascinating things. On the left is La Décade Égyptienne. To briefly explain, in the French Revolution, they threw out the Gregorian calendar. As far as they were concerned, there was year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, etc. And it began when the assembly created a new constitution. A decade, as a result, was a week. Even though it sounds like a decade in England, 10 years, it's not. It's actually 10 days. So a month was now 3 decades. So there were 3 weeks of 10 days per month, 30 days a month. and they all had their separate names, like Floréal, Germinal. They threw out all of the other names. Hence, that's why this one is entitled. It's effectively the Egyptian Week. And this is the official newsletter of the Institute. And in this, they recorded the minutes of the meetings and explaining what has been discovered, what they found. And this is one of the first mentions of the Rosetta Stone. The one on the right is it's the Courier. How have you read this week's Courier? No, I have yet to get it. This sort of thing. It was a newspaper produced for the troops and all the occupied peoples. Effectively, when they got to Egypt, they were repeating what they had done so successfully in Italy. So the idea was that as an occupied culture, you must now be informed what your occupiers are doing to see that they're not really so bad after all. And that's more or less what the Courier is doing. And this, too, is one of the first descriptions of the discovery of the stone.
That's interesting, really interesting.
Also, you'll find, I believe, if I get this right, yes, there is a spelling mistake. Of course, the antiquated spelling of the time. When you, as an editor of Georgian memoirs, I was quite baffled by the way, in the same sentence, they would spell, the same word three different ways. Spelling almost didn't matter. You got that impression. I think it was only when they started using movable type that someone said, no, we must have a standard here somewhere, please. So that's what happened.
Interesting. Oh.
So this now is, I'm going to describe this as, it's actually very similar to the castle here in Cape Town, but this is Fort Saint-Julien. It's state of the art. It doesn't have, if you notice, it doesn't have rising squared off walls, which will be impacted by a cannon. Instead, it has slanting bastions, and they're very low walls. So cannon fire will just pass right over the top. This was the latest thing in fortress design. So this is where the Rosetta Stone was discovered. There was a teetering old 15th century tower called the Burj Al Rashid, just the Rosetta Tower, that was built by Kate Bey, if I recall, in late 1400s. It was not quite falling down, but the French could not use it for their modern cannons. They couldn't put a 24-pound naval upstairs in a crumbling tower, so they pulled it down. When they pulled down one particular rampart wall, the story is described very clearly in letters by the savants. And this is part of the myth busting I wanted to do while writing my books, was that many people have said, oh, it was discovered by soldiers tripping over it in the sand. Or, no, actually, the Rosetta Stone was discovered by someone who found it on a rubbish tip in Paris. This was actually a story put about in about 1857. Nobody knew any better because publishing was in a different way back then. It was found in the foundation ditch of the wall. That is, Bouchard, who was the savant engineer on duty in the renovation of the fort, spotted it immediately as something valuable because he saw the inscription on it. He jumped down into the ditch, used a little brush that he kept in his pocket, just in case, and dusted it off. Within minutes, he had the work gang hauling the thing out of the ground. And what he realized was that this is a slab of very, very strong, hard rock. It's nearly a foot thick, it's about a yard long, and it's perfect as a major foundation keystone for a fortress. That is what the Egyptians in 1450 had done, because stone is very hard to come by. There were no quarries as such, like you get in Italy or France or Germany. You can't just hack out stone easily. And of course, if it were done in a hurry in 1450, they couldn't wait for granite to come down the Nile from, say, the cataracts, Aswan, and so forth. So what they did was they reused stone. So they brought a lot of rubble from the damaged ancient town of Sais, in the Delta. And this is why they believe the Rosetta Stone was actually set up on the temple there. So this is part of this 19th century socio-political attitude of England and France to Egypt. That is, and in fact to Italians and to the Greeks and to the Turks as well. Oh, you just leave your valuable artifacts lying out in the elements, or you use them to build walls with. You don't deserve them. We can take care of them properly in our fine museums. And that was their argument for hanging on to these pieces, because these backward nations clearly don't know what to do with them. This, of course, has all changed. You have different attitudes now, but you're into a whole difficult world of museum administration, and that in itself is a cultural problem anyway.
Yes, I think Johnson. Correct me if I'm wrong. I was last year in Egypt, and they're not building, or they have already finished it. One of the largest museums in Cairo on Egyptology, and they want everything back. And
Yes.
we have also in Frankfurt lots of. I mean, it's interesting in Frankfurt. Okay, which is a museum city in Germany. We have also lots of Egyptian artifacts. They're everywhere. In
Yeah.
Washington, here in London, in Paris, in Frankfurt, in Berlin. Everywhere you go, you have Egyptian artifacts in,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah.
But this is part of one of my things was the repatriation of artifacts that I wanted to do. In fact, I dare say I was faintly rude about the British Museum, but they were very generous and they sold my book in their shop anyway. But um, it's difficult. You must be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yes.
In that, after the liberation of Egypt, if you like, from the French, the new Mamluk administration became aware of the hunger for Egyptian artifacts in Europe. So he quite happily gave license. He sold off pieces, and these were all transported out of the country, totally happy to the Egyptian authorities, in an understanding that Egypt had been brought into the European um, recognition, if you like, European mindset, that it was now known if we put our artifacts in Europe, they will be interested, they will come, who knows, and his influence would expand. This was Muhammad Ali Bey, and he was no fool, and he made considerable money for the nation by selling and shipping many artifacts. In fact, the Philae obelisk, as we're going to come to, which also stands in England, it was given under license to its explorer discoverer. Many of the pieces were, but many of the pieces, of course, were not. And those are the ones that caused the controversy. One of the worst in Germany, of course, is in Berlin's Neues Museum, the Bust of Nefertiti.
Yes. Yes.
That is a story all on its own.
Yes.
But in the Louvre, they have the Dendra ceiling, which I believe we'll see shortly. And of course, the biggest in London is the Rosetta Stone.
Yes.
And this was how, when I produced the book, I was in contact with Zahi Hawass and the director of the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, the Alexandria Library, Dr. Ismail Serageldin, and they have done incredible work bringing the world to Egypt and expanding Egypt to the world as well. And in fact, Professor Hawass had, I believe he's amassed something akin to 100,000 objects that were taken out illegally from digs. So yes, it's very much important, and it's part of my work and part of the books, and it's possibly even informed the fiction, the attitude of don't trust Big Brother or the man flying the flag because he might not be doing it for the same reasons you are, that sort of thing. So, for example, if you ask the British Museum at a patriotic level, should we give back the Rosetta Stones? Absolutely not. It is a trophy of British arms. But if you stopped ordinary people in the street and said, do you think we should give back the Rosetta Stone to Egypt? Because they would really like to have it back. What would they say? They would almost certainly say, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
So this is the difference between nations and the people that make up nations.
Absolutely.
So this painting now, this was an aborted attempt by the Ottomans to invade in 1799. So what had happened was the reason for Saint-Julien was renovated was because of a threat from the Ottomans. Bonaparte here has almost just returned from his murderous campaign in Syria. So his entire army is up there in the Delta. The Ottomans landed 15,000 men, but because of the way Bonaparte orchestrated his troops, he did not let them off the beach. They couldn't get inland. And as a result, they were pushed back literally into the sea. Many of the infantry drowning as they tried desperately to swim back to their ships. They just could not. In fact, the French even captured the commander, Mustafa Pasha, in a dramatic thing. Murat burst into his tent, crashed it open, and Mustafa was drawing a pistol to shoot at him, and Murat slashed him on the hand with his sword and removed some of his fingers in so doing. It was extraordinary. The great Kleber, whom we're going to encounter shortly, he was a giant man. He was an Alsatian man, so he's from the south of France, half German, half French. He did not like Bonaparte and his, if you like, sort of not peacock attitude, but his PR world that he had created for himself, the myth, and of course was a foot taller. After the battle, Kleber apparently ran to him and embraced him, more or less lifting him off the ground. That Kleber was so impressed. That was the first time Kleber was impressed by Bonaparte in this respect. The rest he was doing as a duty to France. But on this day, Bonaparte had done very well as far as Kleber was concerned. And that was 1799.
And how many men did Bonaparte have on this?
Okay, now, so yes, in the Battle of the Pyramids, he fielded 25,000. This left about 10,000 in reserves and admin and clerking and so forth, rear echelon. He took roughly 13 to 15,000 into Syria. They were so ravaged by plague that when they got back, he had in the field, he could only field about 12 to 13,000 men here. Basically, he had lost almost a third of his army to sickness and battle. The Ottomans had landed 15,000 men. But in my opinion, Bonaparte did not, it was not through numbers. They might have matched each other, yes, but Bonaparte could probably have done what he did with far fewer men than he had, as we witness later on by the Battle of Heliopolis. That in itself is another extraordinary story. I can talk about that later. But yes, so here we are. This is the general on the one hand and the Sultan on the other. He was known to the Egyptians as Sultan al-Kibir, Great Sultan. So the generals were referred to as sultans. Each one had a name. So General Dessay, who was his great cavalry leader, he was known as the Just Sultan. Kleber, I don't know. He might have been the furious or ferocious Sultan, but the rank of Général en Chef, Commander-in-Chief, came with the title Sultan al-Kibir.
Interesting. Fascinating.
So here we are.